Bill, thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks for always asking me the easy questions on Kentucky Tonight. I appreciate that a great deal. But my name is Bill Bissett. I'm president of the Kentucky Coal Association, and it's a real honor to introduce our next speaker because much like our congressional delegation, most of our delegation who have disagreements with the person I call the most powerful man in the world, our president, his administration, and many of his supporters, it's easy in my role in Kentucky to be critical of the president, to be critical of his policies as they relate to electricity production, to be critical of his actions that have hurt us in Kentucky economically, and especially in eastern Kentucky where we've seen a downturn. But the good news for Kentucky Coal is we remain third in the nation in coal production. Unlike my home state of West Virginia, I'll say Kentucky has captured what that low-cost, reliable electricity can do for manufacturing, for your businesses, for your lives, for every facet of our life affected by electricity. And our next speaker, much like most of our congressional delegation, has the same challenge. It's easy to be here in Lexington, Louisville, Pikeville, or Paducah and be critical of the president. It's another thing to be down the road from him and be critical of that person. But how Quinn does that, much like our previous speaker said, with intellect, with acumen, he's not a bomb thrower. He's somebody who gets things done. And the National Mining Association that represents not only coal production nationwide, but also hard rock and other mineral production, has many challenges, much like we do in Kentucky. As one of my board members said in a recent board meeting, I was listing all the accomplishments of the Kentucky Coal Association to the people who literally pay our bills at Kentucky Coal Association, and one of them stopped me and said, Bill, we can win Kentucky, but still lose the nation. And that's what makes this man's job much more difficult than mine. He has my respect, he has my appreciation, and I look forward to his remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, the CEO and president of the National Mining Association, Hal Quinn.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Bill. That was very kind, and I would say on my part a little overstated, but that's okay. That's part of our business. You know, I tell our team, as challenging as things might be for the business community, and particularly for the mining industry, and especially for coal lately, what we need to do is we need to focus on what we can control and then do the best we can to influence the rest. And frankly, the influential part starts right here in rooms like this, in cities like this. I'm very grateful for the close relationship the National Mining Association has with the Kentucky Coal Association, and I know Bill and his team work very closely with the Kentucky Chamber. And we work very closely. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is very supportive, as well as the National Association of Manufacturers, and they understand why too. Let me give you a little bit of a background on who my organization represents. Certainly, coal is a huge part of our portfolio, but it's also, as Bill mentioned, it's metals, whether it's precious metals, base metals, industrial minerals, agricultural minerals, and then also we have a large contingent of manufacturers, those who manufacture mining-related equipment, whether it be big excavators, trucks, but also the technology and also the other pieces that go into building and maintaining and operating a mine and processing and refining the product to get to manufacturers and others who need it. So we like to think of ourselves as the front end of the supply chain. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit today, is about electricity policy, electricity, and particularly as it relates to the industrial segment of our economy, manufacturing. So part of what I'll talk about is a little bit of a background, and then we'll talk a little bit about the policy, because I think the policy framework is really what is something that's going to have much more lasting impact, and something that, if you care enough about it and what the consequences are, you may want to think about. Maybe that you think the policy is something you can't control, but it is certainly something you can influence, and that's something to be thinking about, particularly as you look at your businesses and how they're going to be positioned looking ahead in a very competitive global environment. So let me start with manufacturing, and I apologize for the fact that I'm spitting back to people in this room facts and metrics that you all are very well aware of. But I think it's a good starting point, and it's hard to dismiss the fact that Kentucky is, one of the top 10 manufacturing states, as if you measure it by percentages of the gross state product. And I believe it's probably 6 or 7 at this point in time. And if you look at the segments of what is really important to Kentucky, it starts with autos, it moves on to the food and beverage industry, chemicals, machinery, fabrication of metals, and so forth. And many of these are very energy-intensive industries. So it's very important in terms of watching what your inputs are to your cost structure and what you rely upon. So you have, and you're blessed here in Kentucky with the 4th lowest industrial electricity rates in the country. On the other side, in terms of your generation sources, over 90% of your electricity is generated from coal. So as much as when I'm in the Commonwealth, I like to talk about bourbon, basketball, and then coal, I had to suggest that when we talk about Toyota, bourbon and basketball was probably just an add-on benefit about locating here, but it had probably a lot to do with obviously a very skilled workforce, but also low power prices and a more simplified supply chain. And part of that supply chain is when you look at some of the other energy-intensive industries here, if we look at some of those, whether it's going to be primary metals, fabrication, chemicals, and so forth, I mean, those are all pieces of the supply chain that feeds Toyota and Ford here with the 150 truck. And so you have Century Aluminum here in Kentucky, which I believe, I may be wrong, if somebody from Century is here, they could correct me. I believe with the 2 plants they have in Kentucky, Kentucky has the largest aluminum capacity in the United States. And that's a very energy-intensive piece, and I'll give you a little bit of a side story on the Ford 150, now with the aluminum body. They were actually tested in one of the mines for one of my members, the Barrick Gold Cortez mine in Nevada. And the reason they brought it there was to really give it a rough workout and see how these aluminum beds in particular stand up. And frankly, the miners didn't know that these were aluminum beds. They weren't told. They were just given these 150s and said, hey, drive them around, treat them just like everything else. And it turned out very well. Certainly there were dings and things, but no holes, so you don't have this rust. One of the miners did say, at first we kind of wondered why our GPSs weren't sticking to the side with the magnets. He says, but we were too busy to really give it any thought until the very end of all this. But anyway, just to bring the whole story together in terms of the supply chain, the importance of having the low-cost power that really flows through the entire supply chain, whether it's a finished product at autos, when you'd walk through, I don't know if Will James is still here. I don't know how many miles of belt line he must have in that plant. It could be 20 miles for all I know. So you got a lot of power going through there, welding, all the pieces that go into it, and of course all the entire supply chain and its vendors here in the Commonwealth, which makes it a simpler supply chain and more competitive. So let me just talk about one of the issues that we are very concerned about, and perhaps you might be as well, and that's what's happening to our electric grid. And the first thing to start with is, how do we value that? How do we value the fact that we have a diverse electric grid with multiple sources of generation? So Daniel Yergin, many of you might know, who's a renowned energy expert, Pulitzer Prize author for writing The Prize, and also runs the firm called IHS Energy, which is very well known. But they did a study that tried to put a value on what happens if you take your major baseload components of your electric grid, which are coal and nuclear, and you just took them out of the grid, and you try to make that up with sources. For instance, natural gas would be the major default source, and then on to some of the more variable sources, intermittent sources such as wind or solar. So right off the bat, what you see is that if you're taking coal and nuclear out of the mix, you're talking about close to 60% of your generation in the country. Of course, here in Kentucky, if you took coal out, you're talking about 90% of your generation. So the value that this diverse generation mix of the grid putting aside the engineering values and things like that, and having balance in the system, is $93 billion a year in terms of utility bills. The other factor is, and particularly for, well, I think homeowners as well as businesses, it really reduces the prospects of volatility in your bill by half. It says 30% here, but that's in terms of the pure volatility, but in terms of the probability, it reduces by half. And I think a lot of businesses would say, hey, I'll pay a little bit more if I know it's going to be more consistent than if it's going to go up and down as well. So there's two things: pure money, pure cost, as well as the volatility and predictability of your power costs going forward. So if taking those out in terms of what it would mean to your wholesale prices, IHS Energy, Daniel Yergin, found that it would mean that wholesale prices would go up by 75%. And frankly, that's something that would more likely than not have a disproportionate effect on industrial customers, since the fuel cost or fuel production cost for power is a larger share of the industrial bill than it would be for retail. So the other part is that, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, I'll show you a little bit how it works, is that what we call the turnover cost for taking your baseload coal and nuclear out of the grid is around somewhere in the order of $730 billion, $500 billion just on the coal side alone, since coal is a larger piece of the grid than nuclear. And what the turnover cost is really the opportunity cost of deploying capital and other less productive uses, which would be to replace those plants that are still perfectly operational today. So you'd be competing for capital with power providers who say, oh, I had to close these plants because of policies, and now I have to gather capital for really heavy CapEx projects to build new power plants to take their place. So back to volatility a little bit. For all practical purposes in the electric grid today, there's only two fuels that are really competing head-to-head based on cost and price, and that's natural gas and coal. And this tracks, certainly with natural gas and the shale revolution, we've seen a dramatic decrease in pricing on natural gas, which is, frankly, that's a blessing. It's a little bit of a bane for some of my members who are trying to sell coal. But, we don't fault natural gas because, that's really not been built on subsidies and other types of government programs. It's really been on the back of technology and innovation, much like what the coal industry had for many years in terms of boosting its productivity nationwide during the late 80s all the way through the early 2000s. But there is something to be said about volatility in your bills and in your cost. Natural gas does tend to exhibit much greater volatility because of seasonal pressures, multi-year cycles, things along those lines. Whereas coal is a lot more steadier and probably a lot more cost-driven in terms of when you're seeing the final pricing. The other thing that natural gas has that tends to make it more vulnerable to these types of spikes, at least historically, and many of you recall the late 1990s through about 2007 or 8, and you'll see it on this chart, the spike in natural gas prices, and at the same time we saw a huge offshoring of our manufacturing sector in the United States. And that wasn't all driven by natural gas prices, but natural gas prices as a key feedstock for many key industries in our country, it was a major player. And if it had not been for a more stable electricity price, mostly bolstered by coal and to some extent baseload nuclear, things might have been even worse. But the fact is, in terms of natural gas serves, it's a great fuel, but it also serves a lot of masters. We're putting a lot of saddlebags in that mule. So we have, as a feedstock for many industries, like chemicals, certainly electricity, and there's a growing share of electricity. We have in the commercial and the household sector in terms of heating, and now we're talking about putting it into the transportation sector, and before long, it will be major exports from this country in the form of liquefied natural gas. So there's a lot of masters that gases or markets it's serving. So a lot of pressures in one place will increase the cost. For instance, you know, if natural gas prices go up because our policies are driving more, building of more natural gas power plants, that's going to be a double whammy over time to industrial users as well as the households. Higher electricity prices plus higher natural gas prices. So I think what I'm talking about today is, as we look at our electricity policy, it also has implications for our total energy policy and as well as what our industrial policy here is in the United States. So let's go to where Kentucky sits. Well, there's a little bit of a spelling problem there, and I think maybe there must have been a battle in the back room of the editors of this thing in my office, or, and I had this done to me before, they may have put that in to see whether I actually read this in advance. Either way, young people stay in school. That's all I got to say to you. So I apologize for that, but perhaps we'll coin a new phrase here when it comes to electricity policy. But let's look at Kentucky just quickly. See, the other countries we have up here are really actually, they're major auto exporting countries as well. So they were picked with some reason to show if we're going to focus on manufacturing, particularly in Kentucky today with the auto emphasis. So we look at Germany, we look at Mexico, we look at the UK, we look at Japan. So this chart, it's indexed. 100 means everything's indexed to what the average US industrial price is. And so you see Kentucky is actually below the US average, but even more importantly, it's 2 to 3 times lower than major foreign competitors. And so that's a huge advantage. And certainly natural gas has been a huge blessing in terms of shale gas and discoveries. So that's really also helped position U.S. manufacturing very competitively, as well as some other factors with some of the other third world developing nations. Wage structures are now rising, so the delta there is getting smaller and smaller. But here's a big one. So if we talk about natural gas, we say that's a huge blessing. But what I pose to you today is, could we lose that blessing by faulty electricity policy that actually mitigates the advantage you're getting from natural gas, because then our electricity prices go up, and they're both inputs into your businesses. So let's talk about, let me just talk about Germany for a moment. This is almost a case study, and a recent case study of how bad energy policy can create really bad consequences. So Germany, after 2011, after Fukushima tragedy, announces it shuts down, very much in the short term, half the nuclear plants in the country, and announces that by 2022, the remaining ones will be closed. So here you have a major cost-effective baseload source of their electricity in a heavily industrialized nation, just taking out a good chunk of its baseload. The other thing they've been doing is they've been believing that they can actually make up these gaps even before they had to close down they decided to close down the nuclear plants, with various policies, particularly for wind and some solar for intermittent sources. So they've actually saddled their economy with very high-end, very expensive feed-in tariffs to undergird these other sources so they can be dispatched at the same level, or forced to be dispatched at the same level as nuclear was and coal was. And Germany's a heavy coal-reliant country as well. And then finally, I think what Germany's finding out now is that some of these policies are not only much of, when you're over in Germany, if you talk to some of the business community, they'll tell you their biggest concern is that they're being hollowed out. The industrial complex is being hollowed out because of poor energy policies in Germany. And then as we're seeing that now the government's starting to wake up and say, wow, these feed-in tariffs and other things, they're actually fiscally unsustainable for them right now. And so the cost is being spread not only to the industrial customers. You hear discussions in other parts of the European Union because of similar policies about energy poverty. And we're talking about in the developed world, not the developing world, things along those lines. So those are some things. I think there's so I think I think Germany is an interesting case study, and you can go to other places to see the same thing. But Germany's, I think, an excellent example. And it reminds me of when we talk about electricity policy, it reminds me of a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill, but I don't know if it really was. He said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." So I think our challenge is going to be, do we need to try everything else, or can we learn the lessons very quickly we're seeing in other parts of the globe? So I think on the German example is very apropos, because I think we're seeing a little bit of that here in the United States as we confront energy and electricity policies here. The difference is, rather than nuclear being the target, it's coal. And in the United States, coal has traditionally supplied a lot larger percentage of electric power in this country than nuclear ever did in Germany. And I think one of the things that we need to be aware of in terms of things that threaten the diversity of the grid that we just talked about and the value it brings is there's several items. First of it's awareness. You know, the public generally just takes our diverse grid for granted because we inherited it, and it's always worked very well. So there's probably a lack of awareness about what the grid is made up of and how changes to it can have different consequences. The capacity markets right now, particularly the wholesale deregulated markets, aren't really providing the cash flows necessary to retain some of these baseload power plants. They are so busy now trying to accommodate renewable power, the variable power sources, as well as what some people would call phantom sources, which is demand-side management, which is using less, which is fine, good thing, but when you might need the power, if those are bid into the market as resources and they don't show up the day you need the resources, you have a huge gap there, and that's problematic. So the pricing in some of the markets is really depressed, and it's not providing, some of these power plants aren't really making the cut in terms of the auctions, and even when they do, the cash flows are not really sufficient to cover their all-in cost on this. And of course, then we have some regulatory policies that are really, frankly, they simply are designed to accelerate the retirement of power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants. So here, this map here is showing what our analysis has shown is two phases of policy-induced closure of coal-fired power plants. So the red circles depict those power plants and the capacity that's is being retired, has been retired, being retired, will be retired since 2012 through 2022 because of the Mercury Rule that the EPA promulgated. The second ones are what we see as potentially further induced closures due to carbon dioxide regulations that will probably be announced here in the next week. So let me just go to the Mercury Rule just to clear up a couple. We just came back from the Supreme Court. Our organization took that case all the way to the Supreme Court. We had it reversed. Unfortunately, it was too late. Many of the decisions had to be made years ago, so many of the announcements about whether a plant would retrofit to comply versus looking at the economics and saying it's not worth it, they had been made by the time the compliance deadline was April of this year. We got the decision in June, but really, the power plant owners needed to know 1 or 2 years even before that because they have to make long-term decisions. But here's what's at stake. It wasn't Mercury. People say, oh, you guys don't ever want regulations. That's not true. We actually supported a Mercury Rule back in the Bush administration. We thought it worked very well, and it was overturned by the courts on a technical reason. And that attack was brought by various NGOs as well as certain states like New York that have high power prices because they didn't think it did enough, in my mind, my view is because to equalize the price of their high price 14-cent a kilowatt hour with your 5.5-cent kilowatt hour. We had already reduced mercury by half at the power plants before this new rule came in. And here's what we told the Supreme Court. This is just not rational rule. This is not rational policy making. They even admitted that the cost of this rule would be, basically it would cost you $1,600 in exchange for maybe $1 benefits. And that just doesn't make sense. And EPA said, well, we could have considered the cost up front, but we decided to do it later after we did the rules. But that doesn't really make much sense, does it? And the fact of the matter is, what makes things worse is that half the cost of that rule were driven by adding on regulations on emissions that the agency itself said, not Mercury, but other emissions, the agency itself found did not pose any public health threat. So this rulemaking really wasn't about mercury as much as it was about carbon dioxide, which is how do we put as much cost pressure on coal-fired power plants as soon as we can to get as many to retire before we even get out with our next round of rules. So this number is a little bit off. We have to readjust it because of some new changes that we've seen. But we're looking at, we think in the end, whether it's the carbon dioxide or the Mercury Rule, it's going to be 100,000. It's going to be 100 gigawatts of power, which is a little bit under 1/3 of the coal fleet in this country by 2022 to 2025. We're probably a little bit high on our initial estimate on the Mercury Rule, but I think we're much closer than EPA ever was. We predicted 65 gigawatts. It's probably going to be like 50-something. EPA predicted it to be 5. So they were off by well over a factor of 10. And now their experts at the Department of Energy say they were way off as well. So I'm not saying we're going to be right on the money with ours, but if you're going to the track, I'd say odds are put your money with our analysis a little bit on some of these things. So here's the next round, the Clean Power Plan. And what this is all about is reducing carbon dioxide. It doesn't go through a traditional way of saying, let's look at the sources of carbon dioxide and say, hey, what can you do to reduce it, become more efficient? It looks at the entire electric grid and says, well, we're going to figure out what the entire electric grid can do by switching out where you'll get your electricity from. So their plan is really based on re-engineering the entire electric grid rather than looking at the sources of carbon dioxide. What they've done, for instance, for each state, like in Kentucky, they've basically run a model they have prepared to say, what can we change in terms of the way electricity is generated, distributed, transmitted, and distributed to reduce the carbon intensity of the supply, the entire supply in that state. So they've built it on what they call 4 building blocks with some assumptions. And the first assumption at the bottom would be that we can improve coal plant efficiency by 6%. Well, it's not even close. We've run a pretty sophisticated model through a contract that says it's closer to 1%. People forget we're saddled with these Mercury rules that actually make the plants less efficient. And so now they want to say, hey, you got to get 6% more, squeeze 6% more. Increase your natural gas plant capacity running to 70% capacity factor, well beyond what the gas plants have been running at historically, which is closer to 50 or so. We'll get more renewables into the grid, even though what they've assumed is beyond any other government estimation of what reasonably can be achieved. And then saying we can reduce the use of electricity at businesses and households by 1.5% every year for many years, which is really not sustainable because as you make each increment of improvement, the next increment is going to be tougher and more expensive. So this is where we see some huge problems. Not only, I won't get into the legal aspects of why there's a problem, but just as a practical aspect of what we see as the weaknesses in their plan about how we're going to reduce carbon dioxide. And nationally, they're saying from the electricity sector around 29–30%. Kentucky, it's going to be lower. Each state has its own target. Each state is told that they have flexibility. They should do a state plan, but my view is there is no such thing as a state plan in this scheme because it has to be approved by EPA, and I don't think EPA is going to ever approve a plan that doesn't meet its target. So you're just moving deck chairs around on this particular ship. And what would be this is all, we talk about benefits of the Mercury Rule. Here's the benefits of the carbon rule. So the bottom line is, the bottom 2 lines are carbon dioxide emissions with and then without EPA's rule. The top lines, 2 lines, not the one in the middle, the purple one, but the top one, mostly you see green, but it's also yellow, those are global emissions before and after EPA's rule. If you're having a hard time seeing a difference, it's not because of the chart and it's not for your eyes, because the difference is imperceptible, it's negligible. So all this, and we estimate the cost at a little north of $400 billion over 10 years. Another study said about $360 billion using another compliance approach. Bottom line is whether it's 360 or 410, there's really no low-cost options in this plan. So let me give you a little bit of an idea about how this is going to work. This is your dispatch curve. At least this is what it looked like, the PGM regional transmission area. And this is how they dispatch. This is what it was advanced. They look at what they call the stack forecast of what would be dispatched according to cost. So at the beginning, you'd have low, the red is nuclear, and then you get into the black, which is coal, and then you get some combined cycle gas, but then you still have dominated by coal through the middle. And then when you get to the more expensive things, which is gas, and then later on some peaking units, that's how it normally would work, and that's how the system works, which is who's bidding in and who can produce the lowest cost, and we get to the next increment, that's what we charge. So everybody gets the price at a particular point in time, no matter what it really costs you. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the green and the blue and dispatch it before the black. And the way they do that is they induce it to be more expensive by assuming their models that you will pay that most Americans will want to pay $35 a ton of carbon dioxide for less carbon intensive energy. So there's really a carbon tax built into this plan. Never mind that Congress was never asked who's usually allowed to do taxes. I mean, can you imagine what the outcry would be if we had a $1 trillion tax put on the floor of the Senate or the House of Representatives? Well, no need here, because we're just doing it in a fine print in some rule, and then they're going to ask the states to do the dirty work for them. So back to the turnover costs to give you a better sense of what we're talking about. Here, what I'm showing you is the difference in terms of the cost of generating power from coal from an existing coal power plant on the left versus the cost from new builds of gas, nuclear, and wind. And if I actually put the existing nuclear on the left-hand side too, it would be actually lower than coal. I just put isolated coal because we're not even allowed to, under new policies, probably to build a new coal-fired power plant in the United States, no matter how better efficiency you would get or lower emissions. They're just not, they're putting policies in place that won't really allow you to do that. So part of the turnover cost here and why it's going to cost you more is because as you close the coal plants that are the cheaper ones, they say, well, we'll run off these new plants. And what mostly people cite is what is the cost of a new plant for these sources and a new plant for coal. But what you really need to compare is what is the existing price of coal for these plants that are going to close prematurely versus the plants you're going to have to build to make up the difference. And that shows you what part of the turnover cost is in terms of power prices and why they will go up. Now, that doesn't really capture part of what we talked about earlier, which is the full turnover cost, which is the capital that is diverted for more productive uses to build those plants. So in some cases, you know, in a lot of cases, many of the coal plants, they've already paid off the investment. So you're experiencing the lower cost through fuel and operating and maintenance costs without the recovery, the amortization. In some cases, that will not be the case. So you'll actually have to pay twice. You'll have to pay to continue to pay for the plant that's being closed that was never paid off. Plus, you're going to be in your rate base be paying for the new plant because they have to recover the capital investment over the early years of that new plant as well. So that's an attempt to illustrate how we work there. This is, you know, some of the folks, when I showed you the benefits, cost and benefits of the clean power plan, you know, you see very little, as noted, little benefit when it comes to the climate. That is very likely why we don't see the administration, EPA, or its allies talking about climate benefits. What they're talking about is we need to do this to show global leadership. Leadership so other countries do something when it comes to that. So if you subscribe to the theory that that has value, and I'm not here to dispute it one way or the other, this is the price you're going to be paying for that type of leadership. This is the wholesale price increases our analysis show will occur, and most of them will occur by 2020 and then stay that way for a while. So this is going to be a quick ramp up based on the way it's currently structured. So in Kentucky, it's about 18.5%. Now, we could be off a couple percentage points, but you know, I think the idea is here of whether it's 15% or 18% or 22%, what are we getting in return for paying that price? So I'll say that the one good news here is that if we can get something in the next round on this clean power plan that takes it down or changes considerably, you know, the coal piece, even though we've lost quite a bit in terms of coal from these earlier policies, the remaining coal plants are going to be, on average, much younger and much larger on average because of that. And they will run at higher capacity factors, because they're going to be needed, and that makes them more efficient. And frankly, I think the entire industrial community, as well as every American citizen, will get the benefit of that, because then we can maintain at least a semblance of a diverse generation portfolio that we talked about at the beginning, which is both nuclear, coal, and gas, but with great balance and resiliency. And that's what really we need. That's what we've taken for granted. And I submit to you, that's what we really need to maintain our global competitiveness here in the United States, particularly for our energy-intensive users. So I'll conclude with that. I'll say that's a picture of the mine where those F-150 trucks were tested out in Nevada, the Cortez mine. You won't see the those big trucks are not made with aluminum, I can assure you of that. And you can't see the F-150s because they're being dwarfed by these particular trucks, and we have to actually put big flags on them so we don't back over them, as well as that's why the GPS piece is also very important, so we can track where everything is going. So I appreciate your attention this morning, and I'd be happy if anybody has any questions or commentary to try to entertain that as well.
Mr. Quinn, as he just said, we'll take a few minutes, and we do have a few minutes to ask him some questions or make a comment. I'm going to turn the mic over to a friendly questioner who has always wanted to host his own program. That's Dr. Bissett again. To present Mr. Quinn with the first question or topic area, and then if you would please, because again we do have some time, if you'd make your way to the microphones, or we have a handheld that we can get to you to ask Mr. Quinn a question or two.
Thanks, Bill. We talk a lot in Kentucky about sort of state versus federal, if you will, on many issues, Hal. But as far as coal production, electricity production, talk a little bit what we can do as a Commonwealth of Kentucky, because obviously being a coal-producing, coal-using state, we're going to be affected. I know there's percentages showed increase, but I think long-term it could affect us a lot more negatively. What can we do as a General Assembly, congressional delegation, governor to kind of defend ourselves, if you will, as we see these changes coming and being supported by other states who won't be affected as drastically?
Thanks, Bill, on that. I meant to mention that toward the end, so thanks for the question, is that, you know, your congressional delegation, for the most part, really understands what I just talked about in terms of the value and the need for a diverse electric grid, a portfolio, particularly one that's anchored by coal. Not simply because of some self-interest about coal is important to Kentucky, which it is. That's certainly on the forefront of their mind, but also because they really understand what happens to the rest of the Commonwealth in terms of businesses as well as all its citizens if electric prices, well, one, if you can't deliver the electricity when you need it, and two, you can't deliver at the price. I mean, I'll get this a little bit off your question. I meant to mention it. So in South Africa, they now have a power gap, okay? And that's because they neglected building the base load they needed to keep up with the growth. So now there's an app you can get in South Africa, which will tell you when you're going to be browned out in your area. Now, I have companies that are members of ours who also own mines in South Africa, and they're very deep mines, and they're gold, they're platinum, and so forth. These guys have to go, they have to figure out days ahead of time when they're not going to run those operations. That's really expensive because that means there's no revenue coming in, and at the same time there's a lot of costs. So they got to keep pumping the mines, and they got to still pay the miners and things like that. But I'm not saying we'll get that far. So what can you do? Well, your delegation understands, but continue to communicate with them. The state legislature has fully understood. I think with Bill's efforts and the chambers and others, I think there's been a high level of awareness brought about what this could do, and there's been a piece of state legislation that's been passed that says, hey, before this state submits a state plan, we're going to have the elected representatives actually look at it, and they should. This is, after all, at the end of the day, this is more of a tax and energy policy issue than it is anything else. And so the elected representatives ought to take a look and say, is this what I want to do for my state? Senator McConnell, Ed Whitfield has been just fabulous. I got to tell you, he's a senior member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and he chairs the subcommittee on power. And he has held EPA's feet to the fire. I mean, I don't even know how they can still walk. But, I mean, and I don't mean just berate him. He asks really insightful questions about how this is going to work. And it's frightening to see the evasiveness of the answers. Leader McConnell. Now, we all have heard about Leader McConnell saying, hey, I'm advising the governors, just don't submit a plan. Well, let's see if this thing gets through the courts, which is actually good advice, because look what happened to us on the Mercury Rule. We go all the way to the court, and the court says, this doesn't work, but the damage is already done. But they've also, both Ed Whitfield and Leader McConnell have also suggested, and something that's perfectly lawful and maybe very appropriate in this case, is saying, let's pass a law that says if a governor doesn't want to do this because he doesn't want to put his citizens at risk, both in terms of reliability and cost, they're going to be able to opt out, which they can under current law anyway. But not only this law would say they can opt out, and we're not going to have the threat of EPA coming in and telling the state, well, I'm going to run your electric grid. So Mitch McConnell has also made some very powerful arguments about why this doesn't make sense. I mean, putting aside whatever your views is on climate, in terms of why this won't fix anything, and it's only going to be very disruptive. What I found very telling was there was a question. Mitch McConnell was at a hearing, and rarely does a Senate leader actually show up at a congressional hearing to ask questions. But he came in and he asked Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA, some questions. And one of them he asked was, listen, if my state or any state doesn't submit a plan, how are you going to actually implement this in the state, for instance, the Commonwealth? Because really what it requires is you to tell certain power plants to stop running or run less, others to run more, build new renewables, build new gas plants, and businesses and households, you need to use less power. I mean, this is all what I showed you, that building blocks. So that's what this is all about. This is what they are assuming. Great question. How are you going to do it, EPA? I mean, put aside where you have the legal authority, where do you get the technical competence to run an electric grid? The answer was, from Gina McCarthy, well, we just hope the states will do this, which tells you they have no backup plan about what happens if a state says, I'm not going to do this. I mean, they'll rattle their sabers and they'll put some federal plan out, but it's sort of, it should be concerning that they have no idea how they would do it themselves, but they're betting on states, you know, taking the invitation and trying to do the best they can and see what happens. So I think I know your governor and the state agency is working on how to comply, and I know Dr. Len Peters, and he's a good man. I just not really that comfortable in terms of looking at their projections on how Kentucky can actually do this. And I'm not going to put myself in say I'm a recovering lawyer, so I'm not an engineer, so I can't go toe-to-toe with Len Peters on it, whether this works. I can tell you one thing, whatever, if it does, it's going to be a lot more expensive than things are now. That's just the bottom line, but you're also taking on a lot of, I think, fuel risk and reliability risk.
Question from the audience, anyone with a follow-up there? Here's one in the back.
Hal, thank you for being in Kentucky today. I've had the great opportunity to listen to you at different presentations you gave in different parts of the country, and I want to thank you for being in Kentucky today, being here in Louisville, especially at the Kentucky Chamber meeting here today, because I think it's really important that folks here that are in the business industrial community hear what you've got to say about the impacts of these regulations. I'm the majority leader in the Kentucky House here in Kentucky. I make a real living too, to be very honest, and think I have some perspective on the impact that all of this is going to have on Kentucky, on its economy, and on jobs. And there's one thing that you laid out that I think is very clear that people in this room need to understand. Whether you work at the Ford Motor Plant, or whether you work at Toyota, or at Corvette, or at GE, or whether you work at an aluminum smelter, where we #1 producer of aluminum in America, getting ready, I think, to be the second leading producer of automobiles in America. We are a heavy industrial manufacturing state that produces thousands of jobs because of one staff that you had there. Now, Kentucky's a great place to live. I'm a Kentuckian, and I'm proud to be an Eastern Kentuckian, to be very honest. But I want folks in this room to know that the impact of these rules and the economy of cheap natural gas, the impact that's already happened in East Kentucky is the loss of 9,000 coal mining jobs. 9,000. And probably that many more or more indirectly that has been impacted as well. But those of you that don't live in East Kentucky need to understand that other parts of the state are doing very well because of one stat that you put up there. Kentucky enjoys the 4th most low-cost energy in America. And that 4th most low-cost energy comes from over 90% of our electricity being produced from coal. There's over $1 billion expansion going on right now at the Ford Motor Plant. Over a $500 million expansion going on at Toyota. Probably a $300 or $400 million expansion going on at Corvette. And all of that includes more jobs for Kentucky. So I think my question to you, that there's no question that places like Kentucky are going to be impacted tremendously, because I think if you talk to Larry Hayes or anybody else in this room that has been a part of negotiating a deal to get the money to come here to expand, and I'd like to add that a $500 million expansion at Marathon up in my neck of the woods, the refinery. $50 million expansion at AK Steel in Ashland. The Governor's Cup came to Kentucky and was delivered because Kentucky is basically maintaining and recruiting and competing for industrial manufacturing jobs, and was for per capita ranked #1 in that and given that trophy. And we celebrate that. But the impact of that, the reason I'm glad we're here in Louisville, is because I hope that people in this room, and I think you do, understand, I think, the impact of our competitive advantage getting ready to be impacted in a very, very negative way, to where we're not the 4th most low cost anymore, to where we're not able to make these big investments. So I guess my comment to you would be this, and my question. The MATS rule was kicked out, sent back to the lower court, but we all know utilities have to make decisions. They've already made those decisions. Your challenge to the Clean Power Plan basically said you can't challenge it till it becomes rule. So I'm concerned about utilities already making those decisions as well by the time we get to the court, and we had a good ruling. There's no question about that. But the scary thing that I saw in your presentation today was that one map that you showed with all of those red dots and the closing of all these power plants, coal-fired power plants that are taking place. When at those power plants, and these utility folks can tell you better than me, that over the last 30 years we have reduced regulated emissions in this country by over 85%. You don't read about that in the press, but we have. The World Health Organization done a worldwide study of the cleanest of the clean air to the dirtiest of the dirty, and guess what? The cleanest of the clean air was here in the United States of America and Canada. So that red map got my attention. I know that's happening. I understand it's happening. But it got my attention. You're getting ready to take off, I think you said 100 gigabytes.
100 gigawatts.
Of power. My question is this, and I'd like for the chamber to look at this, and I'd like for you to look at the studies you've done, and look at the weather forecast over the next 2 weeks. Above 90-degree temperature. Hopefully industrial consumption is coming back. I want you to talk about a little bit about your studies. First of all, the impact on Kentucky, and we all know that because of the rising cost of electricity. But electric grid reliability for this nation. Electric grid reliability. Can we keep the lights on? Can we keep the air conditioners running? Can we keep the industrial lines humming the way they need to? Are we going to have enough power to run this country in the future with an increasing amount of population using more energy, projected to be 30% more over the next 25 years? Thank you.
Mr. Leader, thank you. And I want to say thank you for everything you've done. You've been you're a passionate but clear voice on this issue for many years. I've seen you in Washington many times testifying, coming to talk about the very issues we're talking about today, and it's very effective. You've represented your constituents very well as everybody in Kentucky, particularly when you come to Washington and explain not just to your congressional delegations, because I've seen you spend the time with other state delegations, which is awfully important, because you can tell a story that shares so much. It's not just about coal miners, it's about manufacturers, and it's about low-income people and how they're going to be challenged as well. I agree with you that we've heard a lot about the war on coal, but frankly, this campaign, or whatever you want to call it, is going to do, coal is bearing the brunt of the burden right now, but this campaign is going to do a lot of damage well beyond coal before it's over. And that's what I think these numbers show. And as you said about the unemployed coal miners here in the Commonwealth, our calculation, we've lost at least 45,000 coal miners since 2011 across the country. Those are high-wage jobs. There's 3 to 4 jobs that sits on the shoulder of every one of those coal miners. Frankly, my view is anytime a coal miner loses his or her job, every American loses something, certainly in the way of low-cost, reliable power, and perhaps one day their job as well if we don't remain competitive. So in terms of how we go about the Clean Power Plan, Mr. Leader, our litigation strategy and our legislative political strategy is built on getting quick returns in terms of putting a timeout on the rule while everything gets sorted out. And we're going to continue to pursue a multi-pronged strategy, both legislatively and in the courts at the same time.
Mr. Quinn, if we could take this final question and a quick question, if you will, in response, and we'll move on. I'm sure you'll be able to talk to some people up front, so let's make this our final question.
Okay, thank you. Gary Helper from Leadership Kentucky, and you just shared with us that diversity probably is a pretty good way to go with this fuel usage. Can you just share your thoughts on a national energy policy that would dictate when we use the different types of fuels and for what?
A national policy for using wind and
natural gas and coal and
I think the
nuclear.
marketplace works very well if it's left, if it's not interfered with too much. But what I've noticed is in terms of the markets today, in terms of wholesale markets, they become trying to be accommodative to intermittent, or what I would call sources that don't have steel in the ground, the stuff that actually delivers it when you need it. And it's not to say renewables don't have a role. They certainly do. The question is, can we integrate this the right way? And if you don't have the baseload foundation, you really could be doing some things that we are really unanticipated and don't understand fully on reliability, but certainly on cost. So I'm not really a big fan of, hey, let's have renewable portfolio standards and say, hey, our objectives should be 15, 20%. If you noticed in the graph I showed about wind, and a lot of people might see this, that wind number is way too high. What that wind number showed and why it's the highest is it incorporated what the full cost is. That is the cost imposed on other backup sources of power for the wind source. So that'd be the natural gas and so forth, which you have to have, because if you're talking about a capacity factor of 25%, what do you do on the other 3/4 of the time? So I'm not a big one on major policies, particularly from Washington. But there are going to be some things that we're pursuing, Ed Whitfield is pursuing, and others, that goes to this issue about the wholesale capacity markets and so forth, say, let's make sure the plans fully reflect what the value of baseload power is so we can sustain the nuclear and coal plants we need that really run the system 24/7 as a practical matter. So, the fact of the matter is it's going to be really difficult to get any policy through Congress. And that's what we're seeing happening here with these policies. They're all executive policies because they're frustrated with Congress, so they just say, hey, we're going to put our carbon policy through the unelected rather than through Congress.
Mr. Quinn, thanks very much. You said you will be able to talk with some people up front. I'm sure you'll take your time to do that.